In the quiet streets of Chicago, where families build their lives, one young mother's world came to an abrupt and shocking end. Torsha Tiara Williams, a 27-year-old woman with dreams, a radiant smile, and an unshakable love for her 5-year-old son, was found lifeless in her own home, shot to death, alone in her kitchen. The person responsible? The man who was supposed to protect her, the father of her child, her own husband. How does a love story end in such violence? Was it always going to end this way? Or did the darkness only reveal itself too late? This case doesn't just raise questions about one woman's tragic death. It forces us to confront a deep, unsettling reality. How well do we really know the ones closest to us? Could anyone have seen the warning signs? Or was it too late to save her? Stay with me as we unravel the heart-wrenching story of Torsha Tiara Williams, her life, the betrayal, and the chilling details of the man now charged with her murder. This is a case that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Torsha Tiara Williams was the kind of person you noticed the moment she walked into a room. Her warmth, her energy, and the way her smile could brighten even the gloomiest day. It wasn't just charm. It was who she was. Born on June 28, 1996 in the heart of Chicago, Torsha, affectionately called Bobo by those who knew her best, grew up with dreams bigger than the streets that raised her. She came from North Lawndale, a neighborhood shaped by resilience. The challenges there were real, but Torsha carried herself with grace. She attended St. Malachy Catholic Elementary School, then moved on to Our Lady of Tepeyac High School. Education mattered to her, not just as a means to a better life, but as a path to independence. She later enrolled at Malcolm X College, determined to push forward no matter what life threw her way. Torsha was never one to sit still. She worked hard, holding down different jobs to make ends meet, at Ms. B's kitchen behind the counter at KFC, and even doing security work. But above all else, she was a mother. Christian, her 5-year-old son, was the light of her life. Every decision she made centered around him, providing for him, protecting him, loving him without limits. Friends and family described her as someone who always showed up, whether it was a late-night call, a ride across town, or just someone to talk to. Torsha was there. She didn't have much, but she gave everything. Her compassion ran deep, and people gravitated toward her for that reason. She wasn't loud about her struggles. She handled life quietly, with strength. To many, she represented what it meant to keep pushing forward, especially for Black women balancing motherhood, work, and hope in a world that often demands too much and gives too little. Torsha had plans, too. She talked about building a better future for Christian, about eventually moving to a safer area, about finding stability. But those dreams were stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. And the deeper you look into the person she was, the mother, the friend, the fighter, the more haunting her death becomes. May 9, 2024, began like any other day in the North Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago. But by 3 p.m., everything had changed. A well-being check brought officers to the 1400 block of South St. Louis Avenue. Someone had raised concerns. There had been no word from Torsha in a while. That silence was unlike her. She always made time to respond, always checked in. That day she didn't. When police arrived, they stepped into a quiet home. No signs of forced entry. No struggle out in the open. But what they found in the kitchen shattered everything. There, lying cold and lifeless, was Torsha Tiara Williams, shot, alone, pronounced dead at the scene, just feet away from where she might have made dinner for her son. The warmth of her home now felt empty, eerie, and hollow. As the police launched their investigation, they didn't yet know what direction the case would take. The scene didn't offer many answers. There were no eyewitnesses, no immediate suspects. But those closest to her knew something wasn't right. This wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. As the hours turned to days, the detectives began asking questions. Who had access to the house? Who would want to hurt her? Who knew her well enough to know when she'd be alone? All signs began to point in one direction. Her husband, Kevin Scott. Kevin was no stranger to the justice system. At 39 years old, his past carried the weight of a felony record and a reputation. He was a man with layers, many of them dark. His life before Torture included multiple children with different women, and stories that followed him. Stories Torture may have heard but chose to see past. Perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of love, or perhaps because she believed she could build something better with him. Their relationship was never easy. Some close to Torture recalled moments of tension. She was trying to make things work for the sake of their child. But Kevin's world came with chaos, and eventually it began to bleed into hers. She was a mother trying to protect her son. He was a man whose past seemed to always catch up with him. And though they shared a home and a child, there was a distance growing between them. A quiet fracture no one could quite name. When detectives looked closer at Kevin, what they found raised even more red flags. Kevin hadn't been seen in the days following Torture's death. He was nowhere to be found, vanished. And that disappearance, paired with his criminal history and the rocky dynamic he shared with Torture, turned him from a person of interest to the prime suspect. But still, for weeks, he remained out of reach. While family and friends planned a funeral and tried to explain to a little boy why his mother was never coming home, the man they believed was responsible was on the run. The community grieved, but they also demanded answers. How could something like this happen to someone like Torture? Why hadn't she been protected? And where was Kevin Scott? The deeper investigators dug, the more apparent it became. This wasn't just a case of domestic conflict. It was a tragedy years in the making, wrapped in silence history, and a relationship many didn't fully understand until it was too late. It wasn't until July 18, 2024, over 2 months after Torture's body was found, that Kevin Scott was finally caught. His name had lingered on the edges of the investigation from the beginning, but for weeks, he remained just out of reach. He knew the streets. He knew how to disappear. And while the public grieved, Kevin was nowhere to be found, evading law enforcement as the pressure mounted. When he was arrested, there was no dramatic confrontation, no final stand, just a quiet takedown, and the weight of a murder charge that had been building since the moment officers found Torture's body. His capture brought a moment of relief, but also a flood of questions. Where had he been hiding? Who helped him? And most of all, why did he do it? As authorities processed him, the details of his past began to resurface. Kevin Scott wasn't just a man with a temper. He was a convicted felon with a documented history of violent behavior. His rap sheet wasn't short, and it told a story few had seen in full until now. Assaults, domestic disturbances, disputes with former partners. There was a pattern, one that painted a clear and troubling picture of a man whose anger had long gone unchecked. And now he stood accused of the unthinkable, murdering the mother of his child. The charge was first-degree murder. That alone spoke volumes. It meant the state believed this wasn't just a heated moment or an accident. It meant they believed there was intent, that Kevin had planned it, or at the very least, knowingly took Torture's life in cold blood. As the investigation continued, the prosecution began piecing together fragments of their relationship. Phone records, past police calls, text messages, witness statements. What emerged was a complicated and painful narrative of control, emotional strain, and unresolved conflict. The public responded with outrage, but also heartbreak. Torture's story hit home for many. She was young. She had plans. She had a child depending on her. And she died at the hands of someone who once called her his wife. The story didn't just make headlines in Chicago. It struck a chord nationwide. People online shared her photo, mourned her death, and demanded justice not only for Torture, but for every black woman who had been failed by the system, by relationships, and by silence. Communities rallied. Comment threads turned into vigils. People asked hard questions. How many more Tortures will it take? How often do the warning signs get ignored until it's too late? And while Kevin Scott now sat behind bars, awaiting his day in court, the shadow of what he had taken continued to stretch far beyond the walls of that home on South St. Louis Avenue. Torture's death wasn't just a personal loss. It was a public tragedy, one that left a little boy without a mother and a city searching for answers. As detectives pressed deeper into the case, the story that began to emerge wasn't simple. It was layered, painful, and still riddled with unanswered questions. The crime scene told part of the story. A single mother found shot in her own kitchen. But it was everything before that moment that investigators were determined to uncover. They looked into phone records, communications, and movements in the days leading up to May 9th. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, and nothing to suggest a break-in or robbery, which meant whoever killed Tortia, she likely knew them, trusted them, let them in willingly. Interviews with neighbors and friends began to fill in the gaps. Some remembered hearing loud arguments in the past. Others recalled seeing Tortia keep to herself more often in the months before her death. There had been tension, unspoken, but heavy. And though there had been no official reports filed recently, the emotional weight of her relationship with Kevin Scott was no secret to those close to her. Detectives started tracing his steps, mapping out the last known contacts, locations, and digital footprints. They combed through text messages and calls, looking for a motive or a warning. They needed to understand what pushed things to the point of no return. Was it jealousy? Control? A moment of rage that exploded into murder? As the community absorbed the shock, they also stepped into action. People who had known Tortia, classmates, co-workers, church members, rallied around her grieving family. No one wanted her memory to be lost in a headline or reduced to a statistic. Sabrina Love, a close friend of the family, launched a GoFundMe campaign not long after Tortia's death. The title was as raw as it was honest. Asterisk, Tortia was shot and left for dead. Asterisk, it wasn't just a fundraiser. It was a cry for help, for justice, for remembrance. The goal was simple. Cover the cost of her funeral and raise enough to provide some kind of future for her 5-year-old son, Christian, who had lost more than anyone. As word spread, so did the outrage. Tortia's murder was no longer just a local headline. Her name began circulating across social media, news articles, and advocacy groups. The Black Femicide Prevention Coalition called attention to her case, using it as yet another tragic example of the epidemic of gun violence disproportionately affecting Black women and girls in America. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger and heartbreaking pattern. Her death became a spark, one that ignited conversations about domestic violence, accountability, and how systems continue to fail Black women in silence. And with Kevin Scott now in custody, the pressure on the justice system intensified. The public wasn't just watching. They were waiting, demanding. The investigation wasn't over. The prosecution still needed to build their case. The details, however painful, had to be laid bare. Because Tortia's story deserved more than sympathy. It deserved the truth. Tortia Tierra Williams was more than a name in the headlines. She was a daughter, a friend, and above all, a mother. Her absence is felt deeply by those who loved her, and the grief that surrounds her memory lingers in every corner of the community she touched. Her laughter once filled rooms. Her kindness left lasting marks. Now, silence has taken its place. Her son, Christian, just 5 years old, is growing up with a void no child should ever experience. He doesn't yet grasp why his mother isn't coming back, why her hugs and bedtime stories suddenly stopped. Those who remain family, friends, and supporters have stepped in to protect his future, to be the arms that hold him when the nights get heavy. The community, shaken but united, turned pain into purpose. Donations poured in through the GoFundMe campaign, not just to ease financial burdens, but to say, she mattered. Tortia's legacy is now a call to action, one that demands we protect women like her, amplify their stories, and fight for a world where no child is left asking why. Tortia's death echoes far beyond the walls of her home. It's part of a harrowing pattern that continues to claim the lives of Black women across the country. Her story isn't rare. It's a reflection of a crisis. Gun violence is ravaging communities like hers, silencing voices long before their time and leaving families shattered in its wake. The pain of losing Tortia is personal, but the problem is systemic. The Black Femicide Prevention Coalition has raised the alarm, urging society to no longer look away. They're asking hard questions and calling for real change. Before more lives are lost, more children are orphaned, and more families are left with only memories. Something has to change, and that change starts with all of us. Kevin Scott remains in custody. facing the weight of a charge that has shattered lives. First-degree murder. The man once seen by some as a partner and father is now positioned at the center of a case that continues to grip everyone who has followed Tortia's story. The trial has yet to begin, but even before a single verdict is delivered, the scars of what happened on that May afternoon are already permanent. Prosecutors are building their case, combing through witness accounts, prior history, and the strained relationship that seemed to quietly crack long before the final blow was dealt. As investigators dig deeper, more layers unfold. Layers of a relationship complicated by control, fear, and silence. The question that looms in the minds of many: could this tragedy have been prevented? Tortia's loved ones are still left in limbo, seeking closure while the legal system moves at its own pace. Every court date, every delay, every headline brings them back to a moment they wish never happened. But beyond the courtroom, another battle rages on. A fight for awareness. A demand for justice not just for Tortia, but for the countless women whose names never make it past the local news cycle. This story is not just about one woman. It's about a pattern. It's about a system. It's about the people we lose too soon and the silence that often follows. And now it's your turn to speak. Do you believe Kevin Scott is guilty? What do you think drove someone to allegedly murder the mother of his child? Should cases like Tortia's be highlighted more in national discussions about domestic violence and black femicide? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of the conversation. Because if we don't talk about it, who will? If this story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect even for a moment, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications. This case, like so many others, deserves not just to be heard, but remembered. And when new developments happen, you'll want to be the first to know. We want your voice in this space. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Tortia received the protection she deserved? What more can be done to prevent these tragedies from repeating? Let's talk about it. Let's keep this conversation alive, not just for Tortia, but for every woman whose story was never told. Her life mattered. Her love for her son, her strength, her smile. All of it mattered, though her life was cut short in a way no one could have imagined. Tortia Tiara Williams' legacy is now woven into a larger call for justice, safety, and change. Let her memory be a spark that lights the way toward something better.